Welcome. Greetings to everybody. Whichever part of the world you're listening to our great It's Different News, Views, and Music show. It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Yael Grushka-Cockayne to our show. And I'm really very honored. Our It's Different show is also very honored to feature Professor on our leadership series. Basically, we learn, we care, and we share. And that's all the concept of It's Different News, Views, and Music show. So we are going to talk about effective project management. So basically, what are the nuances? So before we get started on this, I would like to just read a bit of profile for the benefit of people who wanted to know Professor's great accomplishment in the academic area. So Professor Yael is from is a great professor from University of Virginia Darden School of Business, and also she's an associate professor in research and teaching activities, which focusing on data science, forecasting, project management, and behavioral decision making, and associate professor from Harvard Business School, which is super important, right? We have some strong association through HBAP, dear listeners. So it's a really cool. And I just wanted to say very proudly, I wanted to support this the new year Harvard Business Analytics program here. So I'm very thrilled on that. And she has her research published in numerous academic and professional journals, and a regular speaker at international conferences in the area of decision analysis, project management, and management science. Also an award-winning teacher. In fact, I've heard that very many times, winning the Darden Morton Leadership Faculty Award in 2011, the University of Virginia's Mid-Colley Award in 2012, the Darden Outstanding Faculty Award in 2013, and the Faculty Diversity Award in 2013 and 2018. And so a leader of the open enrollment courses for project management for executives, which really got me interested in that. And of course, the Women's Leadership Program. And very recently, the fundamentals of project planning and management. I mean, that's really super important on how project planning is a important matter for a successful execution. So if you look at our title, you see executing the project effectively, or effective project management, which means you got to be like a planning, you got to execute well, and you got to manage. So without much ado, I know you're all waiting, and thank you so much for joining us today. We will be starting with project management, and what exactly when people think of project management is it generally for operational activity to manage, there are companies' goals and objectives and whatnot. So let's just ask Professor, what is that first thing that comes to mind, and or something that she might be wanted to clarify for the benefit of our audience. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for having me here. It's such a pleasure. I'm so excited to be in this conversation to begin with, but also in this forum. So I'm in awe and really excited to be here to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is project management. I think you're right. When people first hear about project management, they have a lot of different interpretations, and it's shaped by their background and their own training and their maybe professional position. What I love about this topic and what I love about my work in this field is the fact that I think that project management is so much more relevant to each and every one of us than people initially realize. Mm-hmm. It's relevant to us as individuals, so on a personal level, but it's also relevant to executives at the highest level, and I'm talking C-suite executives, CEO of companies, because tying your project success and understanding how your project is planned and managed and efficiently delivered is directly tied to the success of a company. And so when I work with executives, when I work with folks and develop their strategic thinking, I just help them map their company level objectives with how they're framing their goals around their projects. And once they realize that those two things go hand in hand, and if you don't connect them for your employees, decisions will be made in projects that are not aligned with how you want your business to be run, then you realize that you're going to have a problem. And so it's all about understanding how we are in charge of how we make decisions throughout projects, and those direct decisions have an implication for how the outcomes look. And so leaders need to care about it, because if they're financially constrained, or if they're reaching some financial limitations, they need to care about when those payments are going to be made. Or if they have competitive forces in the market, they need to care about when their product is going to launch. Or if they think about their relationship with their customer, they need to care about that scope that is going to get delivered or not met in the project. And so each one of those dimensions, the holy trinity of projects, which is time, scope, and budget, how we put an emphasis on each one of those will directly translate to the pressures that we feel in our company. And so again, developing that view from the top towards how we embrace the project planning process and the project execution will lead to a tighter alignment and a bigger success. And if I just want to end with where I started, on an individual level, we sometimes need some tools and some frameworks to help us prioritize our own activities. Where do we spend our effort? What do we do first thing in the morning? How do we prioritize our tasks? What is our critical path? We say these things, but again, we're not always clear as to what we can accomplish if we utilize the frameworks usefully. And I think that individuals walk away from some of these, some of the content and the courses that I teach, they walk away with a lot of personal lessons about organizing their thinking in a different way. So that's one of, that's a long answer to why I find it so interesting, and I love this field. So.
You know what? I can just pick one. I took some notes here. Let me start from one of the first thing I liked is there is the alignment at the executive level, and that needs to be communicated to the workforce and from the C-level executives to the rest of the gang, which is the first thing. Because if they are very thrilled and excited, and if that message passed on to the force of which is going to be executing on the project. So see, why we talk about execution, but even before that, the project prioritization, Professor, is the biggest challenge. So one of the main thing is which projects to attack first.
Right.
So what is that which is going to give the best bang for the buck? That's the first challenge. And second thing is there is a dynamism involved, Professor. Please correct me if I'm wrong, because there's always a market conditions changes, the fluctuations, the customer experiences. We are all here in the digital transformation and the disruptive innovation. We are trying to make it work for the customer, but the customer have a different preference. So our project which started has to really go through a little bit of a change. Right. So there is no executive alignment. So you very rightly said that. And the second part, I'm going to ask you as a question here. Whenever you talk about your framework, a structure, something, but people generally think, I don't want to really get into a process thing. I don't know how you get there. I just want you to execute this. So why do you think we need to follow a structure? Maybe can I ask you that as a question?
Yes, of course. So so again, in my mind, it's all about decision making. I want to empower my staff or my people or my team to make the best decisions throughout the project. As you said, projects are evolving. There's a lot of uncertainties. They're never going to follow the plans that we set in place. But I need everybody to make decisions, or my boss needs me to make decisions that are aligned with our goal. And I need principles that will guide me to make those decisions in the way that is beneficial to the organization. And so we don't need to dive into the processes, and I don't need that, every single individual in the organization to dive in there and argue about precedence relationships at that minute detail. But I do need people to convey their preferences and to understand where the strategic priorities lie. So when I come to a junction as the project manager and I need to make a decision, I have some guiding principles. We know that we by no means can compromise on quality, or we know that this feature is a nice to have and we're not willing to delay our product by so many weeks. Like, I need some levers to pull, and I need areas of compromise. If I can identify where my leaders are willing to compromise, but what they're not willing to change, I will be able to make better decisions throughout the life cycle of the project. And even if things evolve, I won't need to go back and get everybody back on the table, because I know where the priorities lie. So that's why I think it's important. I do think that the language and the pressures that project managers, or those just affiliated with projects, even if you're just working on a project, those pressures that you feel are real. And those need to be appreciated by others in the organization. So, in a typical like new product development company, you have engineers perhaps, but then you have pressures from marketing, from sales, you have pressures from finance, you have pressures from all other units in an organization. And if those other units don't understand how the project is flowing, or where the priorities are, or what pressures are being put on the holistic plan or the holistic project as a whole, then again, it will kind of create some tension in the organization. If everybody can be aligned, I think it's much easier to progress.
Yeah. So I think that's very well said, Professor. Thank you for that clarification there, because there is one thing I always find out is, again, I'm a little bit on the operational side of that equation in this example.
Yep.
When we have a product that is supposed to be launched, let's say in 10 weeks from now, and then you have all the product team engaged and the requirements are drawn and drafted, dependencies identified, people have resources identified to start developing and things like that. But then the question here is, there is one responsibility of the project manager to report back status.
Yes.
So the one common thing is, like, always the challenge that comes in reporting back status is, don't call it red. Don't call it yellow. Or green. I mean, if you're not doing, there's no truth. So, you got to call the spade a spade. So that there is a little bit of a conflict, since you mentioned. And because the executives, I mean, in my experience, they always say, what do you need from me? How can I help you? That's the one question they keep asking. And then as a project manager, our responsibility is to have that kind of an elevator pitch that is really required. So that's where is the most of the challenges, because there's always a conflict between the project leader as well as the people who are working on it, because should we really raise a flag and say, we are not really tracking well? Excuse me, we ought to do something different.
Yeah, and part of the tension is also about how information is conveyed, because I don't think it's always natural to think about these trade-offs in this proactive way, or to discuss them up front. Then when we do run into problems, we don't articulate them either. So for instance, okay, what do you need from me? If you have that leader that comes to the team and says, what do you need from me? How can I help? Very often the go-to answer is, oh, I need more resources. Okay, give me more people. That you hear that a lot. Okay, how are you going to solve the problem? Or there's not enough resources. So that's like a go-to answer. But rarely do you really hear somebody articulate to say, we have 9 people. If we had 12, we would be able to save X amount of time, and we would do it in this fashion. And this is how I would use those resources, because they've thought about where that trade-off exists. Sometimes we just ask for more resources because we think it's going to be helpful, but we don't actually sit down and say, really, is that what's going to solve my problem? Maybe I need other, materials, or maybe I need an extra week, or maybe I need to team up 2 different teams to get some new kind of quality going on. Like, we don't actually think about this in terms of trade-offs, and so we don't articulate that further up as well. And so obviously, at some point, it becomes very hard to react to, I need more resources, because there are managers are going to be less inclined to provide those resources if it's not always useful, and if they don't know how they're going to be used. So I think that, again, this language of trade-offs can add some transparency, and can allow people to make those choices wisely.
Yeah. So I think, as you said, the triangle, which is the triple constraint that we have, again goes back to, either you adjust the scope, either you add resources to it, or you add the time to it, for example, right? Or adjust it. So so one thing which really will help answer the executives is to see what is the utilization of those resources that you have. Like you exactly said, the numbers. I think the numbers speak volume.
Yep. Yeah.
Right?
And if you ask people, they'll say they're always constrained on all 3 of those. And if you ask people, every project is limited by time. Well, I would argue that that's not always true, right? So, new product development, engineering, pharmaceuticals, not every project, yes, they want to launch by a certain amount of time, but they will take longer if they haven't met the quality that they need, right? They will spend a lot more money than they intended in order to develop that final drug. And so time COVID aside, so we can come back and talk about how COVID is changing that, but
Yes.
time is not always what's the guiding principle in the development of some products. Whereas if you have some kind of mega event that you have to plan towards, and again, COVID aside, because those events are not occurring as often, but in those cases, the time was of essence, because if you did miss the opening night of the Olympics, then there's no point in continuing to work on that project the next day, right? It's like it's gone. So
yeah. So in other words, we always march towards a target, and then we need to have this checkpoint in between to evaluate whether you are hitting the milestones at various stages of the project to get to the finish line. So one question I have is basically, what is the right approach? Is there like a one size fits all here? For example, okay, give me the requirements, and then I do the t-shirt sizing, I do the capacity, I do what you have, who is available, who is not available, and then I do a timeline and say, based on what I know with this 324 requirements, I need about 1,400 hours, and I'm going to get you in 12 weeks from now. Excuse me, we have an annual event for the company in 6 weeks, so you cannot do that. So is that the approach, or you work backwards and say, okay, fine, you have to do it in your date is already fixed here, and then you really work backwards? I mean, what is your recommendation in this case?
I think you need to ask yourself and those around you the questions of what will happen if we get delayed? Let's say the due date. It's a classic example, right? When you ask a group of individuals, how many of you have worked on a project with a really constrained timeline? Everybody will raise their hand and say, I had a product in a company, or I was in charge of putting in some new financial system, and we had to finish by a certain date, right? Mm-hmm. Or we had to have some certain deliverable at a certain date. But then how many of those folks in those settings turned around and asked their superiors, well, what happens if we are delayed? What happens if we haven't finished this work and we're delayed? Are we going to pay a fine, or are we going to have to shut down? Can we continue working on the project? Do you prefer that I continue to work on the project regardless? Or do you want me to stop at a certain date? Like, you have to ask those questions explicitly, and then you can decide to work either forward or backwards. I think once you understand the flexibility that you have, then you can make better choices. Should everybody work together? Should everybody work in parallel? You have to assess the degree of risk that your project faces. If you're working on a new product that has a high level of complexity and novelty from a technological perspective, you may want to have two teams running in parallel. That's what we're seeing a lot with the COVID now, and the different approach to project management. It's no longer a waterfall kind of approach, but we're working in parallel in multiple dimensions because we're rushing to find a solution, and there's a lot of unknowns, okay? And so if you are building a building that is a little bit more familiar, and you may have done that before because you're a construction company, then you can progress a lot more sequentially and just follow the steps that you typically take. So some of it depends on the level of risk that you're facing, and some of it depends on the prioritization of your goals.
Okay, so that means we, as a project manager, one has to have a clear understanding to see if there are tasks that can run in parallel, or that can be sequential. And basically, it all boils down to the dependencies. That means, like, I got to finish something to start something else, or in the typical project terminology, I have to like a start to start, start to finish, finish to start, and finish to finish. Those are
so there's some of that. So there's some of the it to some degree depends on the dependencies, but to some degree it's also about, do I just go in parallel on very different, almost like two little projects? Like, do I run like two different teams against each other? Do I run like a very different structure to my project versus a much more sequential process? And so, when you're in an environment with a high degree of risk, you want to experiment, you want to jump around, you want to try very unusual new tools, and that's when you try and tackle a project from multiple dimensions. Another way that companies deal with highly uncertain and ambiguous project is with the agile mindset. So I'm sure that somebody like yourself who has a lot of project management experience knows that these days most of the software companies have the option to work in a more agile approach, where they're progressing on much shorter iterations, and they're defining their goals on a much shorter timeline, and always releasing something to the customer. Those are situations where, again, you're faced with a lot of ambiguity, and all you can commit to is the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, I think basically, so my reading of from what you just said is you need to be preparing for the failure scenarios. Means projects can fail,
Yes.
and if it fails for some reason because of some situations which is not under your control, you better be prepared from a risk. This is again one of the key qualities for effective project management is you need to plan the risk of known risk versus unknown risk. And so what are the mitigation plans as you know it? You can't plan for everything, but that's one thing which we do is to make sure that this is the risk, here is how the plans, and then we get an executive buy-in and do it. But again, you're right, especially when a COVID kind of a situation. That's the reason why we are doing this actually. So is to see if this is kind of unprecedented stuff comes in, what do you do? Because now, Professor, I want to get your thoughts. When all these projects were running, people, this thing happened, and now people have reduced the resources. The people are no longer working in the same office. They're all remote. A lot of people are not used to it. So totally, it's like putting spanner in the works. So now, when the lockdown situation ends, everybody is trying to get back to work, not necessarily to the work, but also remote, whatever. Now the question here, Professor, is how do we start? Can I make same assumptions? Because my project assumptions may not be even valid at this time.
Yeah, that's very true. And actually, I think that the current crisis is actually affecting how we think about projects, and it's making my impression is that actually some organizations are much more efficient than they used to be in terms of executing projects, because I think when you're in a time of crisis, you're forced to prioritize. You're forced to say, well, I'm going to focus on these things that are really important, and I'm not going to get engaged with things that are on the outskirts or like are less important, that can kind of sit there and, they usually drag our attention, and they usually require some resources, and we get distracted by them. But right now in the crisis, we don't have time for that. Like, we can't afford to be distracted by things that are not mission critical. And so I think that there is a sense during a crisis that we get behind a project and we go ahead with it and deliver. So maybe not all the projects get pushed forward, but those that do will get executed in a much better way. So that's my sense from what the whole crisis is doing to the world of project management. And I think that that's a good thing, because we can prove to ourselves that we can do better. We can prove to ourselves that we can be more efficient. And we just need to keep that mindset up. If I tie this back to my comment from before, part of what the agile mindset is trying to do, it's trying to create this like sense of urgency. I'm going to work in a shorter sprint. I'm going to work in a shorter iteration because it's always going to be urgent. It's always due next week, right? So it's creating this sense of urgency. Sadly, now the world is in a situation where we are in that case of emergency constantly. We feel the pressure. We feel that we need to fight to survive in our companies. We need to help each other out as humankind. We need to help hospitals accomplish their tasks. And so we are forced to be more focused on really what matters. And the execution of the project, I think, the execution of projects in general get better as a result.
Yeah. So I think, are you more leaning towards an agile method of doing projects rather than waterfall? I know you gave two different examples. The construction would be more waterfall, but in a software development where you can parallel things, do it. Again, one of the key things that, especially in this situation, prioritization is very important. So that means in agile, we have the backlog of things to do. And then you do your capacity planning and what are the resources you have, and then try to do it. So before we get you to comment on this, dear listeners, you're listening to Professor Yael Grushka-Cockayne on this. She's an associate professor of Harvard Business School. Very proud to have her for itsdiff leadership series here. And also she's a professor at Darden School of Business in University of Virginia. This is Srinivasa. Thank you, and you guys know me, and for producing and hosting this It's Different show. And every week we are having different topics. So please like and subscribe to our show. And also there are a lot of leadership series presentations there. including Professor Vish. Earlier, we met on the returning back, rebound from COVID and whatnot. So check it out. So there are some questions there, Professor. Maybe do you think that we can parallelly also take some questions?
Of course, I would be happy to. Do you want me to answer your question about where I fall on the
Yes,
agile?
yes, yeah. Because I'm just encouraging them to start putting
Yes.
those comments, and then please, dear listeners, please start putting those comments. And then while Professor, please answer my question. Thank you.
Oh no, of course, it's a great question. So I'm a hybrid person, and I'm not trying to avoid answering the question, but I do believe that some settings require more of an agile mindset, and some settings require more of a traditional waterfall. And I also think that it's important for folks to understand why they choose one method or the other. So from the work that I've done with many organizations, it is often told from above how we're going to execute our projects, right? It's like something that the company decides, we're all going to go agile, but it's not really clear why we're doing it. It's not really clear what the problems may have been to have led us that way. And so the vision of why it's going to be useful is not communicated properly. I think if folks understand, if they have the freedom to choose, so for instance, companies, there are some companies like Amazon or other companies who each product manager can almost choose, I'm going to work for this product more in an agile way. I'm going to work for this product in a more traditional waterfall way. If they can choose, if they have the idea and the insight, what is it about my project that will allow me to execute it well in this method? And what are the features of the method that will support the specific situation that I'm in? Those are questions that people need to answer before they choose the method. So for instance, I'll give you a concrete example. When you're doing agile, you benefit from a cohesive team that stays together. If you have an interdisciplinary team of 3 or 4 coders and developers and a quality assurance person, and you can work as a team and you stay together throughout the year, then it's great. Then it's fine. Then you can develop your sprints, you can look at your backlog, and you can improve every week. But if you have a very highly specialized resource that has to do a task, and then they're out of there and they have to go to a different team and perform a different piece of work, then it's going to be very hard for you to do agile over a long period of time. And you need to think about, well, I really need to plan that resource's time out to slot in my project where I need them. And so then you're probably going to go in a little bit more of an organized, long-term kind of vision, which is more aligned with waterfall. So it really depends on the nuances. And so companies, I think, develop their own hybrids to fall somewhere in between, depending on the attributes of the project at hand.
I think that's very well said. The hybrid is kind of what most people are more aligned to, but the key thing is you need to do some self-assessment as a project leader. And the second thing is, I was going to ask you the question about what is the secret recipe for doing this, executing projects successfully, and you give one of them: organized. Right? What else? I mean, can you touch on that? Because agile means, I think the other meaning is synonymous, is organized. What else do you think is important?
Yeah, so I'm a strong believer in planning, not because plans are going to be a reality, but I think planning prepares you for what you're about to face, and you feel more confident when you've planned. You feel more confident starting things and reacting because you know the ins and outs of what you face, right? So if I planned well, then I know kind of where the risks lie, I know where the sensitive parts are, I know what I really need to accomplish, and then I can kind of pivot pretty quickly. So first, proper planning is really important. I also think that this day and age, and I'll link it to a topic that you and I have talked about before, I think that we can be more sophisticated in how we plan. So, we typically come up with project goals. How do we come up with those? Well, there's a little bit of guessing. There's a little bit of estimation that nobody trusts. And then we come up with a project plan. People kind of doubt it. And then we don't look at it and we move on. But, data science now, analytics, that there are so many great tools out there for prediction. And there's a lot of data that gets collected. So let's apply some analytical tool. Let's come up with better forecasts. Let's talk about probabilities. Let's create an entire distribution to forecast where projects are going to end up. And if we add more rigor to the process of planning, we will likely find ourselves, having a better ability to match execution with whatever we thought of upfront, because our project plan had uncertainty in it, and it was more sophisticatedly calculated, and we had comparables, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why we baseline at least to have a plan. So one of the things that I tell my team all the time is you need to have a plan. It's okay. You don't have all of this right, but at least have a baseline, and then you just see how the progress travels as you make progress, and then you always can make some corrections in you. As you said, Professor, the estimation techniques is not right. You never
Yeah.
made clear assumptions, which is not good. You never documented your dependencies. You never anticipated the right skilled resources to be in the project. I mean,
Right.
all of these are something which we learn. So incidentally, Rahul on the call, he was asking question about, I'm just reading his question, is as the firms, they are using analytics project management today, and how?
So it's emerging. It's not as common as I would like it to be, but there are many different ways to use analytics, both during the project planning and also during the execution. So, for instance, one of the things that we just mentioned related to estimation can rely on heavy duty analytics, and I work with some startups that are really developing machine learning methods for projecting delays in project using historical projects. And so there are sophisticated analytical tools that could be used to improve the way that we come up with these initial goals and predictions, and to help us identify some areas of risks. So that's one way in which project analytics can be developed, and companies that are heavy into project management can be more sophisticated. But even during the execution itself, as the project is progressing, analytics can be used throughout. It can be used to communicate data. It could be used to update where you think you're going to end, and it can be used to track and help give feedback to the teams on things that work and things that don't work. And we've been so disciplined in so many areas around collecting data and using data for prediction. It really puzzles me why so little of that gets translated to project environments. I mean, ask any one of the companies that you've worked in, can you show me, the last time you launched a new product, show me your project plan and show me how things ended up. Just that question, like, most people won't even know where to start, right? They either never update the project plan, so they only have the original plan but no actuals, so they don't even know how things really got done, or they've updated the plan to only reflect the most recent current, oh, I'm just one day late, because I've updated it throughout, so I don't really have the original, and nobody really looks at the delta. And so we just don't hold ourselves accountable in the same way. And so it sounds like it's trivial, but in my mind, those are things that are kind of preventing project analytics to really flourish.
Yeah, I think you're right. See, projects can never be late because I updated the date every day. So
Exactly.
we can never be late. So one thing is actually BT had a question, which is, are there any difference between a normal project management and data analytics project management?
Oh, like managing data analytics projects?
Yeah. I think.
That is such a good question. And actually, I had a colleague of mine, an academic who I know from a different institution, ask me about that. Companies today, some researchers, including at Harvard, there are some researchers who are studying whether or not data science and analytics and machine learning have delivered the value that they promise. And so, and some cast that question in a much more negative way to say, why has machine learning disappointed us, right? Like, why are companies not gaining the benefit? If you think about it, one of the reasons I believe that is the case is because we're not thinking about the project process of the analytics project. We don't think about it in the same project management terms as we're used to thinking in other domains. And so we have a group of data scientists, we have a group of business analysts, and we start with some hypothesis and we do some exploration and we come up with an idea. Actually going back to operationalizing it and implementing it in practice and developing a system that takes the data, comes up with the insight, and kind of implements a change, that requires, seeing it through. And that, I think a lot of analytics projects just get left at the, oh, that's interesting phase. Like they just get left hanging and they don't get delivered to execution and operation because it's not defined, because it's not a target that was set, because it's not clear that who's going to be responsible for that. And so I feel like there's a mismatch, or analytics has not been embraced by project leads who would really see them from start to finish. And that is something that I think is up and coming. And there is a need to develop frameworks that will help analysts and business analytics folks understand what are the steps to proper execution in order to deliver the benefit.
Okay, I think thank you, Professor, for clarifying. Let's go to the next question.
Sure.
I think Sunil asked a question. Is it prudent to make some statistical inferences, make predictions, understand correlations between variables that are impacting the current project? For example, the cost overrun delays. I think you kind of answered that question, right? People are using to see whether this data tells us that this project is going to fail. I mean, it's something similar, right?
Yeah, and there is some evidence that it can help. There are folks who have done empirical work to show that there are predictions that you can make throughout the project that tell you this is not heading in the right direction, and if you and either you can take some corrective actions, but typically it will also say, you should stop now. We need some help and guidance, so we're not all falling, to the sunk costs kind of phenomenon. Inertia is very strong. We like to execute projects. We don't like to stop projects and say this is not looking very good. And so having those tools and having those relationships established through some kind of model can be helpful, because then it gives us indication this is not looking very promising and we should stop now.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because when I read one of the podcasts where they said when you have an idea, what you do, just form a team. It's all dynamically formed teams. And then what you do is you go test your hypothesis, and then you fail fast, learn from it. And if this is really turning in a positive direction, then go and do the project. The question is, everything happens very dynamically, and you don't even have time to put data analytics into this mix.
Yeah. It's a challenge, and sometimes it's because we're thinking we'll do it fast and we'll do the analytics afterwards, but we don't think about what kind of analytics we want to do up front. If we thought about it when we started, maybe we would collect the right data, we could start doing the analysis, in parallel, and it wouldn't be as divided or separated. But unfortunately, that's not exactly how we always think about it.
Yeah, and there's another comment, Professor, from Dr. Itauma, and one of our very favorite coach here, and like our peers earlier we talked about, right? Design thinking.
Yes.
How is design thinking plays a role in project management? Yeah.
That's a great, these are great questions. You have a great audience just by the questions, I can tell. Design thinking, in the way that I think about it is design thinking really helps us with the scoping. So first, design thinking also gives us a structure, right? So there are clear stages to the design thinking process, and it can give us some very clear guidelines as to how we should spend our time searching for new ideas versus converging to a specific idea. But first and foremost, I think that design thinking gives us a really good set of tools to scope out our project. Like it gives us a set of questions to ask. It gives us a set of ideas to kind of explore and consider and find out about, so we can then say, oh, now I have a better sense for my scope. I can come back and actually plan the detailed project. And so, Jean Lidka, who is a colleague at Darden, she is an expert in design thinking, and she talks a lot about, asking those questions up front that then, in her mind, scope out the work, in my mind, scope out the project, and then you can put your plan in place.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Yeah, good. So I think one of the things about when to call a project as I don't think it's getting anywhere. So we got to really do a course correction, because this is something where I've heard in a different way, which is called a change control process or something to be established. I mean, what is your insight to when do we make the decision, or how long can you allow room to, okay, it will change, this kind of things?
Yeah, I think that it's kind of tricky. You want optionality. So when we plan anything, we like to have options down the road. Optionality adds value. If I can abandon or scale up or pivot, then I have more options. So on one hand, you want to have optionality when you start a project. You want to know where you're going to have options to make decisions along the way. On the other hand, there's always a problem with commitment. If I have a lot of optionality, how am I going to commit to a specific course of action? And I need to know, that when the time comes, I'm going to actually be able to make a decision, even if it feels painful at the time, because there's other psychological effects that kind of play in our mind. And so you kind of have to balance the idea of identifying optionality in your opportunities, but also having a sense for commitment of how you will make the decision when the time comes, and establish those principles up front and say, I'm going to wait 6 months, and if these are the results, I will then decide to abandon or pivot or make this change, right? And so you need to give yourself some flags along the way to empower yourself to consider the bigger picture. And so that is something that there are some tools out there to do it. There are certain decision tree methods that allow you to do it, but it's not trivial and not easy.
Okay. And do you think, Professor, is it something like a project acceptance criteria or like a exit criteria in this case? You know what? I want to exit a phase, for example, excuse me, or I am going to get the user to say, I will accept this project provided if it does A, B, C, D. I mean, is it something similar?
Yeah, I mean, it is something similar. I want to kind of take it in a slightly different direction. I'm writing a paper right now about these like project control, or these like change moments where you revise a project, where you check in, you see how things are going, and then you decide whether you want to adjust where you're headed. Okay. And what's interesting is that what we show in the paper is that our mental framing, so whether or not we check in with the project periodically, or whether we have like a stage gate process where we check in when we've completed a certain phase, or whether or not we check in because we've spent X amount of dollars, every one of those choices has a different implication for the mental process that we have and how we decide to react to the need to change. And so if we were looking at a phased, like a stage gate approach, and we finished a certain amount of work and things are going good, then we're going to be, we're going to feel great about it, and we're not going to try to overcorrect, right? But if we suddenly check in and then we focus on the cost that has completely escalated, then we might try to overcompensate by making some changes to the project. And so little choices that we make that almost, nonchalantly we decide upon can have severe implications for those decisions and those reactions along the way. So change is not easy to manage and to do it well. It can be pretty tricky.
So I think one thing we adopt is in our project management principle, Professor, is the change control board or process, which is actually meant for requirements change, because you go with an assumption, you gather some requirements, you started designing a development. When you just bring it for some early testing, you get to know that there are some new requirements that is coming in, and then you wanted to do this, but it's going to really throw it's a scope creep. It's going to throw a timeline, or it's going to add more resources or cost, for example. So that's one thing that we do. That's basically from a requirements perspective. But the other one that thanks for your great example there, you mentioned this is Mayor. I am not really making progress. So that means I am constantly doing a checkpoint to see where am I, which is like a weekly status report in this case, right?
Yes, exactly. And that affects the decisions that you're going to make, right? So that will affect how you make those decisions and how you react, and then how you adjust, and not always optimally.
Yeah. And one thing which tells me is like, how do you call a project a success? You know what I mean? Like, because it means a lot of things. I am a coder. I delivered. That's it. You asked me to code based on requirements. I delivered.
Totally. Yes.
But that's not his project success, right?
Right. It's not. No, it's not. It's not project success, and it doesn't necessarily always define project success. And some people, if you ask them, they will define project success based on how the team got along. We had a great time. It was great. We enjoyed working together. We all got along. We all were on the same page. And that was a great success. It doesn't matter if they were, a bit late with the product delivery, or if it didn't quite meet the original specs, or maybe then, they end up spending more money, because they really felt rewarded in their own way, right? In other cases, people will key off one of those goals. Did we meet our timeline? Did we meet our budget? And again, I'm not sure which one they gravitate towards. Did we satisfy the customer? Okay, so we satisfied the customer, but we took, we spent a lot more money for our company. Is that success? It's not clear. So some of that has to do with the values of the company. If it's a company that values employee satisfaction, if it's a company that puts a lot of emphasis on their employees and how they feel and their culture internally, then the emphasis will be on how did we execute as a team? How did we work together? If the company, emphasizes a lot more customer satisfaction and long-term relationships with a customer, and they feel like it's more of a relational contract there versus a transaction, then they will care a lot more about the satisfied customers than they would about any other extra cost for the organization. So sometimes, again, and this maybe brings us back to where we started today, that it has to do with the perspective of the company
at a higher level. And then I have this is very good. I have two questions on your comment there. See, that's the cost part you touched, right? Because you focus on cost and say, oh my God, then I got to pull some other lever to adjust.
Yes.
How is that startup company mentality versus a mature company mentality? They're two different things, because one is really hungry and they don't have money to spend, and everything is a very tight budget. The other one is, I don't know what you do, I want to get ahead on the competitive. Again, it goes back to your organizational goals and strategy and what are we delivering. So what are your thoughts on that? So do you think a clear difference between these two sets of
Totally, very different. I mean, again, going back to that kind of trade-off and those and the constraints that you have, a startup company, they run out of money, they're basically done. Like if you run out of your resources, and your resources are typically very tight, then you're done. Like you just don't have where to go, right? And if your idea is great, and if you were, on time, if you've somehow run out of your resource, then you're gonna have to say goodbye to to the small team that you've put together. Large organizations typically have more contingency and have more, spare some resources to allocate. They can take loans, they can take, they can go into debt, they have some assets that they can utilize. So they have other ways in which they can overcome it. And typically it's about, the growth, and it's about opportunities that projects open up. And so you can actually, again, focus on a different dimension and allow things to kind of fall under the 5% escalation or 10% above budget. That's not going to shut you down. You're not going to collapse as a result. And so the tension is different there.
Okay. And so that means when you're doing this project, to constantly follow through, how are we doing, etc. How do we get some early indicators? Like, for example, maybe testing is one example that I could immediately think about it. So what are your thoughts on testing and the adequacy of this to ensure a quality product towards effective project management stuff? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So we write case studies a lot. Part of my job as a professor is to write case studies. And one of the things that you notice when you write case studies about unsuccessful projects. So there's, most cases are about unsuccessful projects.
Okay.
There are fewer cases about successful projects, but if you read about cases about unsuccessful projects, one thing that you notice is that in most of those cases, timeline was being pushed, and so there was a change in the timeline because of scope creep or other reasons. There were things that led to pressure and more pressure on the timeline that for some reason everybody was focused on. And what happens? Testing is always like, it always shrinks. So you start off a project plan, you have, I have just as long in testing that I do in the development, everything's good, 6 months, no problem. First delay happens, or first threat of a delay happens. You're saying, no way we're going to delay this project. What are we going to do? We're going to eat into the testing. Second delay, what's going to happen? No, we're going to eat into the testing, and so on and so forth. And you're left with like a sliver of the time to test something that is way more complicated than even what you originally planned. And so it's one of those phases we never start early enough. Like we never start testing early enough, and it's the one that gets squeezed the most, and it's an afterthought. And so Denver airport case, which is a famous case about a project that had a lot of complications, healthcare.gov and the Obamacare website. There are just so many examples of projects that eventually sadly fail because this testing component was constantly being pressured and reduced to the point where you just don't have the opportunity to learn. Learning is always good. Learning is, testing and finding out new information is always going to help you. You can't lose from getting more information. And yet we wait until the end to do that. So
yeah, so I think a lot of people who are in the quality assurance, they will love your comments. They said, "Hey,
yes.
you guys are your person who make the project successful." So totally fine. One of the things that Professor I try to do and tell my project team is basically get the scenarios written down well from a QA standpoint.
Yes.
And other things, correct me if I'm wrong. The second thing is I also go to business, Professor, and say, what are the true business scenarios that you wanted us to test? And then I have QA and business to share those scenarios together. So that way you get a comprehensive test cases prepared. And then the seed data and other things that is required to funnel, because the common tendency for testing is to just test with any data that is possible, not really realistic data.
Yeah.
So I want them to really get the true data. So that's where the data plays a greater role in terms of the analytics part of it. And then what kind of data is available in the market, or we got to go and fetch it and then use it. So I think testing is very rightly said. I think we got to do, and we never shorten the time frame. So that's again goes back to your point of planning. So as a project manager, you need to make sure you give adequate time for every aspect of the project.
And again, just to tie into some of our previous conversation, one of the beauties of a proper agile kind of mindset is that testing is thought of from the get-go. Like when you plan out your sprint, or when you plan out whatever work you're going to do in terms of the next iteration, you typically, or you should, according to the book, according to the guidelines, you should identify those tasks that you can test in an automatic way, or you can every unit of every deliverable and every piece of scope that goes into your work has to be testable. And that idea that I can validate very quickly and test things very quickly is very important for a proper agile environment. And so, you can, those two things are thought of as in parallel and not in sequence.
Yeah, I think it's more like a professor getting out of a deployable code that is very well baked in, tested, and unit tested, system integration tested, user acceptance tested, and whatnot, usability, experience tested, those kind of things. And one other factor is the automated testing. It's not manual. You don't get 15 people to come and test it. So he's always put some automated test. So the leveraging the right tools into the mix of you just get those scripts in, get the data in, and get the code in. So the data is used to test the code and spit the results. Automation is the way to go. And of course, we make it as a responsibility of the developer to do some unit testing themselves before even it gets, because it's always a conflict between the developer and QA. The QA always puts a defect back to developer, and developer says, no, that's I did by the requirement. No, it's not, this is not working. No, that's not what they asked. Then you go back to product, and product says, yeah, we never thought of it because the business asked like this. It's kind of interesting to keep us busy. Okay.
Yeah, totally. Yes, that's very true. That's exactly right.
Yeah. And can we take one more question, please?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So that's from Prabhu. What happens if the business changes take precedence over project implementation steps? So how do we handle that?
So if business changes take precedence, right?
That's maybe priorities change. I guess maybe priorities.
Yeah. So I think at some point, my advice would be, again, the projects, the project managers, the team involved with the project, they always have to serve the bigger purpose. Like, I mean, when I say always have to serve, maybe I should caveat and say the goal is for us to grow the company or make the company successful and contribute to the company's mission. Okay, there shouldn't be a conflict. So if there's a business change that is being driven at a company level, we shouldn't defend our project because we're heavily involved in it. And I've seen this in academia plenty, and I know that this is true for other organizations. In academia, sometimes you're asked to serve on a committee, you're asked to take an initiative, you're asked to start to invest in a pilot, you go ahead, you run, you start to implement, everything's looking good, and then something else happens to the business and you're asked to pivot. It's very hard for us to let go and say, this is no longer relevant, or it's not helping our core mission as much as we thought. And I think that tension is real. And so when the business is changing, and again, maybe we can think about COVID around us, when the business is changing, we have to be reactive to it. And we have to have the project teams aware of why we're even doing this project and how does it fit in with everybody else. We get very attached, and that's good. We like our jobs. We are very proud. We get attached to what we want. We have this desire and sense of satisfaction that we need to complete a piece of work. But sometimes the business has shifted and we need to shift with it. There's plenty of retailers that have pivoted some of their manufacturing lines to start producing face masks. And they're, like apparel, shopping, I do a lot of shopping and I like clothes. And, some of the companies that I know have, spent some of their resources in that area, coming up with face masks and other products that are necessary right now. I assume that before this crisis, some individuals in the organization might be focusing on the next fashion line or the next product or the next kind of set of items. And they may have been asked to stop and to pivot. And that's a really hard thing to do. But I think that that's our responsibility.
So I think now you mentioned a couple of times about the current unprecedented scenarios, COVID. So maybe let's focus the next 5 minutes to see what else can we do in terms of resuming a project, in terms of like managing or restarting a project, which is same thing, or totally starting a new project.
Yeah.
So because they're all we are a little bit worried about wave 1, wave 2, and all these things. I mean, right? So what are your advice and recommendations if we are going to either resume or going to start a new project? What do you think that we should do at these kind of tough times?
Yeah, so I want to end on an optimistic note, just because, it's late here in Boston and I want to go to bed optimistic tonight, which is important this day. But I think that it's hard to resume everything. It's hard to resume where things were before. Like, I feel like this is a moment in time where we have an opportunity to kind of clear the deck a little bit and go back to rethinking some of the things that we took for granted. And so we've learned. The good news is that the world has, in the past 3 months or 4 months, the world has learned a lot. There's a lot that we have yet to learn, and there's a lot of uncertainty still, but there's also things that we do know now that we can be more creative about. Service industry, restaurants, entertainment, people are rethinking a lot of their old habits, and that includes old projects. Imagine you were working in a restaurant and you wanted to do a certain construction project. Well, you should probably go back and rethink it. Or if you're starting to develop a new layout for an office building, or if you're starting to put in place a certain system of service that you're going to provide, how do you think about scheduling and appointments? Like, there's so many little nuances that you can now change the way that you think about it and plan up front to be more nimble and be more flexible, that it's an opportunity for us to rethink it. So if you are in that position, you embrace it and say, let's just go back to basics and say, have any of our fundamental assumptions changed to take us into a new direction in terms of our project?
So in other words, be positive, be open-minded, make your assumptions, revalidate your assumptions, and just do a critical thinking. And like you said, you need to have the right mindset and attitude, because we all need it. I mean, at this point of time. And of course, it's a great team, as our comment listeners pointed out. It's a team effort at the end of the day. And so to quickly summarize, Professor, you need a good business strategic support, so that which goes top down for project prioritization and support the project managers and program managers to help the project. And then any time the it blocks, the progress is blocked, they are there to come for the rescue and support. Then as a project manager, you need to be, as you mentioned, thank you, strong in planning. You
Yeah.
got to be organized and very structured,
Yes.
follow a process or follow a structured framework, and leverage the data analytical tools to see if that is an early indicator for your success or failure, right? And of course, do some early testing and gather some nice feedback and stuff, right?
Yeah.
And of course, knowing pretty well that a project can change dynamism in the market or unprecedented things, whatever, you need to be, as a project leader, as a project manager, you need to be able to make those, adjust the levers to appropriately with the triple constraints, so whatever that you have in terms of your scope, your time, or your resources stuff. So I think it is very interesting, and we thank you so much. It's a lot of learning, and I never said I understood everything about project management. There's more to cover, and also being agile, and that's one thing which is very true. In fact, I've been requested for to talk about agile project management on Saturday, so it's very good. And thanks for all. I learn every day. I'm just sharing my learning and appreciate your time. I know it's late for you. Thanks for every one of our
Thank
listeners.
you for inviting me. Yes, thank you for inviting me and for listening. Thank you so much, Sri. This was awesome.
Joining us, yeah, and we hope to catch up with you at some other time, because I wanted to even talk about your book or your course in Coursera, Fundamentals of Project Planning and Management. Your Coursera, congratulations, by the way, 150,000 people enrolled over 200 countries worldwide. That's awesome.
Yeah,
And I like your style of teaching. Thank you so much for that.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and I'm going to look on the project management for executives, because that's something I interest me to see what an executive should do, what a project team should do, and how they meet up. And also, one last thing before we close for this session is, not project management is not just operational in nature, it's also a strategic angle. That's one of your first point, and
Yeah.
I am thankful for bringing such insights, because the folks who are listening to this, and then I'm sure definitely they will catch up. In fact, I'll try to get the links on your Coursera course and stuff. I'll try to punch it in for our folks in our archives, and then hopefully they'll do it. So folks, this recording show is available on YouTube immediately, but I'll try to put it in the comments so you can pick it up. Once again, this is Srinivasa from itsdiff, News, Views and Music Show, and that was Professor Yael Grushka-Cockayne. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Bye.